welcome to another episode with Purnima Rajan with us. We've been focusing on a lot of different and specific issues that we'd like to deal with athletes. Today it's a little bit more about how are we as caregivers, support staff, the whole bunch of people around these players going to be able to identify when they need intervention. So thank you once again for joining us. And this seems to be top of the mind for me, at least, with a lot of matches that are coming and with a lot of pressures that players are facing. How do we identify for a start, or what are the indicators? Let us start with parents, because they are the people who spend maximum time with athletes as children. What are the indicators that you think could help parents understand, okay, now is the time that I alone not sufficient. I need to take the outside help.
All right. So for parents, the biggest advantage is that they're mostly there with the player, whether they're on the ground or they're at home. So one of the quick indicators that you can identify is if the child or the player has a sudden change in how they are behaving. A player who's usually enthusiastic, gets up on their own, gets ready on their own, goes for training in the morning or goes for fitness in the evening. There's a sudden pull. They're not getting up as early as they used to, or they're taking a lot longer to get ready and they come back, or there's a general slightly increased levels of exhaustion that they feel. It's a good idea for parents to sort of flag that off if it's been persistent for more than a week or so. And it's a good idea to get an opinion. If it's more physical based behavior changes like fatigue, loss of sleep, loss of appetite, stuff like that, it's a good idea to get the doctors involved and see if everything's all right, if their nutrition is on point or if their vitamin D is on point and so on. But if it's more psychological in nature, like they're a little bit more anxious or they're a little bit more stressed, they're getting irritated or angry easily, then it's a good idea to reach out to a psychologist and then talk about it a little while. It's the mantra which is really good is like sooner rather than later. So it's always a good idea to get into the system faster, so that we can pick up on problem areas faster and we can intervene at a much earlier stage. So therefore it helps the player also to bounce back very quickly.
Now say they do not have this awareness, which is probably the common cause, and there is an issue that is there, whatever indicators you're there. Till when do you think the parent themselves, or better still would be, how can they identify who they can go to? Are there groups like that?
You're right. The awareness in this space is relatively low in that space, but it's always a good idea to have a system ready for the players. So either the associations who are heading this forefront can make or educate the parents and the community that these are important members of the support staff for the player. It's not necessary that every player has to meet a doctor or a psychologist, but it's a good idea to know who to meet earlier, so that in the event that our player needs that help, they already know where they need to reach. So it's a good idea to have a database on hand. It's a very good idea to have a support system that's already built into the association space, so that they know that they can come back, they can ask the questions that they need.
So this is on a professional front, but for a very long time athletes remain on the amateur front, at least here in India still, and it's good that the intervention starts even at an amateur level.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. I think mindset and mental strength per se has to start as early, and it's sort of like the foundation for the resilience building. So at that point, it's not a counseling kind of setup, but it will be more of activity based, or it can be more of exercise based orientations that can help improve mental strength. But that is like a 5-minute or a 10-minute exercise on a regular day, but can have a huge impact on the player's performance.
So you spoke about mindset, mental strength, and then there is another word, mental conditioning.
Yes.
How is that different?
So mental conditioning is a voluntary exercise that we put ourselves into to build certain psychological strengths, resilience, tenacity, and so on. So we have a particular plan, a structured plan, and we head it towards a particular direction. Versus mental strength and resilience are things that experience of living life sort of gives it to us, and so on. So if we're saying we're training for a particular sport, and that particular sport requires you to have a certain degree of attention, a certain degree of focus, a certain degree of ability to relax certain parts of the body more than other parts, that is a very structured program that you need to have, and it varies from one sport to the other. So that's mental conditioning. So that's also one of the places where if a player is changing sports that they're interested in, let's say someone who has played more of an upper body game like archery or volleyball, is now moving to a lower body game like football or swimming, for example, they'll have what is called as an habit interference. The muscle memory will sort of contradict with each other, and it takes a while for the player to adjust. So in such kind of position, mental conditioning works because you're voluntarily and mindfully taking a step back to unlearn certain behaviors and then relearn new behaviors that will help them be more competent at the sport that they're playing.
And does that also help in the mental strength part that you're speaking about? Because again, this is also an experience that they are undergoing, and I'm sure when there is a certain level of mental conditioning that's happening,
Yeah.
automatically, rather organically, as a strength system that's also building.
True. So when we were looking at mindset or mental conditioning, we look at it in two different parts. We look at it in one angle, which is the cognitive elements. Cognitive elements is how we perceive information. So there's attention, there's memory, there is perception, there is language, there's grammar, all of that. So it's how the brain works and perceives information, brings about an output. Then there is an aspect which is psychological in nature, which is your stress tolerance, your frustration tolerance, your burnout tendencies, which is more emotional in nature. So there's the brain, the neurocognitive elements, and there are these emotional elements that are there. Mental conditioning can work with both, but how you go about intervening with both are very different exercises. So that's when the structured elements come in. So for a certain sport, you might have to focus a little bit more on the cognitive elements, like archery or shooting, for example. In certain places, it's the emotional element, especially in group sports. You can get frustrated when you're in a team because you feel like, you're not being guarded well enough, or your players are not, you're particularly having a bad day. So a lot of the emotions can come into this space and so on. So it's very heavily dependent on what you're trying to do and what exactly are you trying to intervene at, and the modality of training and exercises will change accordingly.
So it's not an easy thing. I mean, it takes a long time. So when people talk about I'm a mental conditioning coach or your quick fixes in your book,
it's never, it's not sustainable. Quick fixes are like bandages to a viral fever kind of. I mean, it helps.
and it's just a viral fever. I like that. சம்பந்தமே இல்லாம இருக்கிறதா. Alright. So now we spoke about the parent bit. Then comes the other side of athletes, which is the coach part.
Right.
So now, probably because of a paucity of time, we as coaches, I'm being this space as well, I made the effort to understand what it takes to also understand that the player needs help. I understood it, the system is there. But at that point in time, in the midst of a tournament, all of this work has happened pre-tournament. I've spoken to the sports psychologist. During a mid-phase of a tournament, how, when this access to players over a phone is not available, the game is happening, there is a certain anxiety that the player is feeling in the midst of a game where I have no access to any of my devices. What do you think will be a good way for the coach to handle the player then? Because after the parents, it's the coach that the player spends a lot of time with.
Right. What is important at the pre-training phase is that the player does get a one-on-one time with the coach, and the coach gets a one-on-one time with the player. A coach can be very helpful in identifying two specific kind of motivators for a player. Does the player need a little bit more force in the sense to help them focus, or does the player need a little bit of reassurance to help them focus? So if we can create this as a divide, everything else can follow on very quickly. So one-on-ones help in that sense, that it helps build a rapport between the coach and the player. Subsequently, during the game, if the player is anxious or stressed, they can use the same modality between reassurance or force to sort of help them focus. So in that space, the coach is the only person in that position who can command that kind of control for the player as well. But otherwise also, coaches' presence are there, whether they're in the training phase, the practice games, as well as in the competitive games as well. So the coach is the person who can give proper feedback about how the player performs under pressure and outside of pressure. So it is very important that the coach is a part of the overall intervention plan as well, because their inputs do make a huge difference. They can also be the first ones to alert the parents and say that, hey, there's something else that's happening here. They need to get the kind of help they need, and also provide the direction that the family or the support system needs to give as well.
So the coach also needs to be educated on this front as to what to identify, like you said, whether it's force or reassurance. Now, what does the coach themselves need that kind? How do you, they can identify, like you said, if they're part of the system. At that point, I'm going to put you on a spot here. There is a game happening, and you know that the player needs both. There is a paucity of time. Which does a coach choose? Reassurance or force? You know that the player needs both at that point. So I'm also under pressure.
Right.
If I choose the wrong thing, what could possibly go wrong?
It could significantly impact the player's performance. It can probably impact the player's mindset on seeing themselves having a future in the game as well. I think very recently a lot of information has come out in that space as well. So very often, I think at a professional level when they play, I think there's a lot more clarity in terms of what they can expect and what happens. So there's already a certain degree of experience that comes with it. So they know when a game's going a little low, how to kind of bounce back and so on. But the biggest stress points are when a player is transitioning from an amateur player towards a professional player. So at that point, a lot of feedback that they get from the system around them does impact them quite a bit. So at that point, coach's presence, the support system presence, far more integral, I feel, as opposed to when they've already hit the professional spaces.
So you're putting a lot of pressure on us.
Always.
So the next question, of course, comes to peers. Peers are also important in this whole space, how each player interacts with one another to keep themselves going. So because very often in a competitive space, I think in a group environment especially, seldom do you actually find people who genuinely kind of want you to, push the limits, push your bar. I may not be as competent as the other person. No, I know it. And I think that is also a big stressor for all these kids, players, athletes. Where I know that you are my friend, but you and I are also in the same, competing for one spot. That itself, I feel, is something that we need to help players understand. Yeah, you're competing, but beyond that, how do they, best is this way, how can they separate themselves in terms of a relationship from the game to their personal space? Because very often it seems to be so mixed that becomes a problem for identification as well. I don't know whether I'm competing with you or whether I'm your friend. I think players find it very confusing very often.
I can speak a little bit on the cultural elements that are involved in this space. A lot of us in the Indian community essentially identify performance at any level, whether it's academic, vocational, or sports, is very dichotomic space, in the sense that it's either success or failure. So even a player who's going in to perform views her or his own performance in the structure of a success versus failure model. That is what disrupts a lot of the social experiences that the player has as well. And unfortunately, we consciously or unconsciously instill that expectation on the player as well. If we are able to drive a little bit more energy and attention to the process, it can be a little bit more competitive, and it takes away the load that it has on their ability to socialize with their own peers and so on. So it's the concern of I'm competing with a friend, so are they still a friend at this point? All of that comes only when we look at it from a success versus failure point of view. So a lot of people who do instill that expectation are the other support systems that are there: family, friends, relatives, coaches, benchmarks, all of those things. So I think as a as an overall, maybe we need to rephrase that entire ethos or that rule of how we are working on. So it's a bigger picture, much larger picture in that space. But it's also important that we kind of help reorganize that thought process for the player when they're starting off as well. Because individually, it's very unlikely that people look at each other as competition. It's only after a particular time when there is, oh, but but you didn't perform over here, or this didn't work out because this person did better. That constant feedback that they get from the environment is what creates that competitive nature.
So that means a change in a larger picture is so large that by the time it happens, but I think we can bring it in slowly, can't we?
I think
in certain points.
I don't think we should take the entire weight off the competitive spaces, but it's important that we are able to demarcate what is the downtime when you all can relax versus when you're on, in game mode all the time. So somewhere in just being able to know when they can sort of decompress and then become a little bit more focused, if we can start in places like that itself should help.
With the kind of I think attention on them, that's where I think this whole decompressing becomes an issue, especially when we look at top athletes.
Yeah,
this spotlight is constantly on them.
Yeah.
So as much as the amateur wants to move to the professional phase, I don't think they are ready for all the other things that come along with moving into the professional space, right?
It's sort of a misassumption in that space that when we decide that we're going to do something at a professional capacity, there is an already unsaid expectation of themselves that they can't relax or recover at all. They have to be on all the time. Very recently, there's a lot more awareness on what a recovery period will do for a performance player. It's very recent. I think it's less than about 10 years. In India, I think the expectation is much lesser than that as well. So we only focus on training and endurance and injury-free performance and stuff, but we never actually looked at recovery in the forms of nutrition, sleep, rest, and all of that. So socialization becomes a part of the recovery process as well. Time with family and friends become a part of the recovery process. So the understanding over there is very less over here because we always look at those things as sacrifices.
Which is why identifying it is also becoming difficult because it is not considered as taking a step back. It's taking a step away, not back. Now, like you rightly said, it's more recent. The last 4 or 5 years in India, these kind of terminology where they say, no, I'm going to spend some time with family has come into play. Recently, a friend of mine was talking who's in New Zealand, and they were talking about how much even the professional field players will prioritize family over everything else. They could be probably playing the finals of the World Cup, but if there's a childbirth happening, they prioritize that over this because they feel that is the more constant. But here in India, that's a big no. If you prioritize family, it means they start saying you're weak.
Exactly. Exactly. I think we operate under the assumption that that is the success formula, but it is not. And it's a high risk for burnout for a lot of the players.
That's exactly my next word. So then burnout. How did you identify burnout? Because we spoke about parents. These are the parents who also set the success and the failure formula. We talk about coaches who are supposed to identify when you have a burnout. Again, that's also success failure is the way they are going to identify. There's a physical burnout you said about how lack of sleep, appetite, mental burnout. How did you identify that? I mean, unless you are given some time off, identifying it is going to be very difficult.
But just like how there's a physical expectation that you can only run a certain amount of kilometers before you tire out. Similarly, the mind also works the same way. So you need to give voluntary rest for the mind as well, which is something that we tend to underestimate.
Completely. Because here if you don't work means prayojaname illa.
So and this is again extremely culturally imbibed, where we look at rest and recovery as something that is unnecessary or lazy or sedentary. I think we need to rework on all of that, which is where awareness comes into play, where the support systems or the whole association in which the player is playing or the community in which the player is performing itself starts telling them that, hey, there are days you're going to be running, you're going to be pushing yourself, and there are days you have to allow yourself to relax, and we'll figure out that balance of it. So it starts from the grassroots level. If you don't learn it at the grassroots level, changing that behavior or changing that belief system at a much later stage becomes very hard.
Quite brilliant point that you've just said, because what I'm observing now is young children, I'm talking about less than 12, are being pushed to their limits.
Yeah.
And they don't seem to understand that there needs to be some balance.
Yeah.
Even if it is tilted at the early stage towards a socialization point of view, so be it. But there's a tendency for the people around them to think if you do that, it's wasting your time on frivolous things. I had recently a player come and talk to me. She asked a couple of questions. One was, she said, I'm spending time on the phone. I enjoy it, but then after a point, the realization is, oh, spending my time on this means I may not do as well in cricket as somebody else who's not spending time. I said, so there is no time off for you. I said, if you find that the phone is addictive, then it's something that you can restrict yourself now that you have all your time options that you can. But the next question was even more surprising. She said, I spend the evenings talking with my friends. There are times when I feel even that should be avoided if I have to perform better in sports. She had this question and the answer by herself. She said, I need them, but I also find it a distraction. So there are so many complexities, like you said. It's considered taboo to have a good time in a professional space.
Yeah, because we're very heavily instilled with the thought that we need to make sacrifices in order to win. But what exactly is sacrifice, and are we doing the right kind of sacrifices becomes the next question.
Ashwamedh maybe.
So we're all pushed to sacrifice more and more, but the amount of effort that we put, even if it plateaus after a while because I'm getting tired physically or mentally, the immediate instinct for most individuals, and I'm not just talking about players, but most individuals say, oh, I'm not doing enough, so I need to do more. So it's more likely that we'll sacrifice more of our sleep, our appetite, our social circles when we're actually tired, because we think we need to put more time because effort is lacking on our side. And somewhere that becomes a very unsustainable approach. And to prevent ourselves from going into that space is why we need to instill some amount of ethos on what rest and recovery is about.
So, end of the day, when do you think an athlete should kind of say, I want to step back? Is there any indicator for that for them? Because there could be very often a conflict, especially an athlete under the age of 18 whose decisions are still dependent on others.
Yeah.
If there's a conflict, the parents feel one thing and the coach feels another thing and the athlete is caught in between. What would you say could be an indicator for an athlete to understand that they need to take a step back and maybe for some time do something else if they want to actually go ahead in this?
One of the easiest ways of figuring this out is to maintain what is called as a qualitative calendar. A qualitative calendar is where the individual, the parent, as well as the coach rates the quality of the performance or the training that the athlete has performed. There will be variations in that. So parent might view it lesser or more, the player might view it lesser or more, the coach might view it lesser or more. You can take an average of that and identify, is the graph moving upwards, is it plateauing, or is it going downwards? If you feel like it's plateauing and it's going downwards, it's a good idea to take a step back, because very often than not, your muscle memory also starts to learn things that are unnecessary for the performance. Like if you're making more errors, your muscle memory learns the errors more than it does what is the right way to play and so on. So it's a good idea to disengage from a pure learning habit and then distract away, do something else, recover, come back, and so on. And sitting down and having that one-on-one conversation with the player and coach will also identify, is this a physical tiredness where the body is sore, the neck is sore, sleep is an issue, and so on, or is it a mental fatigue that comes in? So no, my body is all fine, but when I go into bowl or I go into bat, I'm not able to focus. So suddenly I find my mind wandering somewhere else. So then it's a mental fatigue. So you give them that sort of recovery that they need over there as well. So having a qualitative measure that the player and the coach and the parent is monitoring will very easily explain, okay, how do we feel about things and what's happening. It's the most objective way of doing this.
I think the best part of the conversation has been this, because it's a great learning for me as well, that I can probably start this off with players. So thank you so much, Purnima. This was great. So as parents, as coaches, we have a responsibility towards the athlete in terms of identifying when is it that they need to step back, find that period of recovery, not just the physical recovery, the mental recovery as well. And if you want to have a measure, look at the qualitative calendar like she just said. And we'll see you again for more of such fantastic inputs from Purnima. Thank you so much. Thanks, Purnima.
Thank you.
If you like what you hear, not just in terms of what happens on the mental front, at physical front as well, do like, share and subscribe to Coach Aarti.